My friend, I've come to tell you today that prayer is not a ritual, it is not a routine, it is not some whispered line you say before you close your eyes at night. Prayer is the greatest weapon God has placed in your hands, and if you learn how to use it, there is no mountain too high, no valley too deep, no enemy too strong, and no circumstance too impossible for you to overcome. You see, life is a battlefield. You don't have to look far to know that you are in a fight. The fight may be in your health, it may be in your finances, it may be in your family, or it may be in your mind. And the enemy of your soul wants you to believe that you are helpless, that you have no defense, that you have no way out. But I'm here to declare you are not defenseless. God has given you a weapon that cannot be broken, that cannot be silenced, and that cannot be taken from you. That weapon is prayer. When you pray, you step out of the natural and into the supernatural. When you pray, you shift the battle from your weakness to God's strength. When you pray, you are saying to the devil, you may fight me, but you cannot defeat the God who fights for me. Prayer is not you begging for survival. It is you declaring victory through the one who already conquered death, hell, and the grave. Oh, listen to me now. Prayer is more than words. It is a force. It is a power that shakes the heavens and unsettles the plans of hell. When you pray, angels are released. When you pray, doors begin to open. When you pray, chains start breaking. Some of you are one prayer away from the miracle you've been waiting on. Some of you are one prayer away from turning the whole battle around. And here's why you must hear this until the end. Because the enemy knows something many believers don't. The greatest threat to his schemes is not your talent, not your money, not your education, but your prayer life. The devil trembles when you go to your knees because he knows that when you connect with God in prayer, you are unstoppable. That's why he distracts you. That's why he discourages you. That's why he wants to keep you silent. But if you ever make up your mind to pray without ceasing, there is no force in hell that can stand against you. Prayer is your lifeline. Prayer is your power. Prayer is your greatest weapon. And tonight I challenge you, don't just hear these words, put them into practice. Take that burden, take that sickness, take that fear, and bring it into prayer. Because when you pray, heaven moves, earth shakes, and victory comes. Prayer is not just communication, it is confrontation. Too often we treat prayer as if it were a polite exchange of words with God, a soft whisper before bed, a quick sentence spoken at the dinner table, or a ceremonial act to check off a list of spiritual duties. But prayer in its deepest and truest form is not passive. It is not soft. It is not weak. Prayer is the strongest act of warfare a human being can engage in, because prayer confronts everything that stands against the will of God in your life. When you bow your head, when you lift your voice, when you utter words of faith, you are not simply speaking into the air. You are confronting powers. You are standing against opposition. You are tearing down walls and pushing back forces that you cannot even see. Prayer is not simply about speaking. It is about confronting fear, doubt, sickness, sin, and every enemy that dares to rise against your destiny. Think about it this way. Life itself is not neutral. Every single day you live, you face resistance. There are thoughts that come against your mind, telling you that you are not enough, that you cannot succeed, that your best days are behind you. There are sicknesses that try to weaken your body, circumstances that try to discourage your spirit, and people who sometimes try to diminish your worth. These are confrontations whether you recognize them or not. And if you try to fight them in your own strength, you will often come up short. But prayer is the divine strategy given to you by God so that you can confront those forces head on. In prayer, you do not stand as a weak human being. You stand as a child of God, armed with his authority, clothed in his power, and backed by his promises. When you pray, you are not simply expressing your heart to God. You are pushing back against everything that is trying to rob you of your peace, your joy, your faith, and your future. Prayer is confrontation because it does not allow fear to remain unchallenged. When fear whispers that tomorrow will be darker than today, prayer rises up and confronts it with faith that declares, God holds my tomorrow in his hands. When sickness attacks the body, prayer does not surrender. It confronts it with the belief that God is a healer. When depression tries to bury the soul in darkness, prayer confronts it with the light of God's presence that no darkness can overcome. Prayer is confrontation because it is a refusal to let the enemy's lies have the final word. Some people say prayer is simply therapeutic, a way to calm your mind or soothe your emotions. But true prayer is far more than therapy. It is battle. It is a fight. When you pray, you are entering into combat, not with fists and weapons of this world, but with words of faith and truth that carry the authority of heaven itself. And that is why prayer cannot be weak, half-hearted, or mechanical. It must be fervent. It must be passionate. It must be persistent. Because in prayer, you are not negotiating with the enemy. You are confronting him and declaring that he has no right, no authority, and no power over your life. Look at the examples throughout history. Every man and woman who has ever done something great for God first knew how to confront the battles in prayer. Moses confronted Pharaoh's resistance not by clever speeches alone, but by crying out to God and calling down plagues until Egypt released God's people. Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal not by debate, but by calling down fire from heaven through prayer. Daniel confronted the decree of death by opening his windows and praying to God 3 times a day, even when the king commanded otherwise. Jesus himself, the Son of God, confronted the power of sin and death by falling on his knees in Gethsemane and praying until sweat poured like drops of blood. Each of these moments teaches us that prayer is not communication only. It is confrontation with the things that stand in the way of God's will being accomplished. And what about you? What is standing in your way today? Maybe it is a voice in your mind that says you are not worthy of love. Maybe it is a sickness that the doctors have told you will only get worse. Maybe it is a broken relationship that seems beyond repair, or a financial burden that keeps you awake at night. These are not just situations, they are battles, and the only way to confront them is to take them into prayer, because in prayer you do not confront them alone. In prayer you confront them with the God of heaven and earth standing at your side. That is why the enemy works so hard to keep you from praying. He doesn't care if you sing, if you read, or if you talk about God as long as you do not pray. Because he knows that when you pray, you confront his lies with God's truth, and truth always wins. Prayer is confrontation because it refuses to allow the status quo to remain unchanged. It is saying, I will not accept this sickness as permanent. I will not accept this fear as normal. I will not accept this bondage as final. It is standing up in faith and daring to believe that God is greater than what you see, greater than what you feel, greater than what you hear, and greater than what you fear. Prayer confronts because prayer believes. It looks impossible in the face and says, with God, all things are possible. There is a power that rises in you when you realize this. You no longer pray timidly, wondering if your words matter. You pray boldly, knowing that your words, backed by faith, are striking blows against the very gates of hell. You are not just saying words. You are shifting realities. You are not just whispering into the dark. You are calling forth the light. You are not just asking for change. You are confronting everything that resists change until heaven itself intervenes. So, my friend, never again think of prayer as a mere formality. Never again see it as something optional. Prayer is not an accessory in your life. It is the armor you wear. Prayer is not just communication. It is confrontation. And the moment you decide to use it as such, you will find strength rising in your spirit, courage filling your heart, and victories breaking through in your life that you never thought possible. Because every time you pray, you are confronting the forces of fear, doubt, sickness, and evil with the unstoppable power of Almighty God. Prayer is the invisible weapon that produces visible results. It works in realms we cannot see, and yet it creates outcomes we can touch, experience, and live in. Many people misunderstand prayer because they do not always see instant changes. They think that because nothing shifted the moment they whispered a prayer, that prayer must have failed. But prayer is not bound to human timelines or visible evidence. Prayer is a seed sown in the soil of the unseen, and like every seed, it takes time before it pushes through the dirt and appears in the open. Just because you cannot see it at first does not mean it is not working. Every time you pray, something moves in the invisible, and eventually, that invisible movement brings forth visible results in your life. Life itself operates on this principle. The deepest and most powerful realities are often unseen. The air you breathe is invisible, yet without it you would not live. Gravity holds the entire universe in place, yet you cannot see it with your eyes. Love, hope, faith, these are unseen forces, but their effects can transform a person's entire existence. Prayer belongs to the same category. You cannot hold it in your hand. You cannot weigh it on a scale, but when you pray in faith, you release power that rearranges circumstances, opens doors, and breaks chains. The invisible always precedes the visible. When you pray, heaven begins to work in ways beyond your understanding. God dispatches angels, aligns opportunities, changes hearts, and orchestrates events in ways that you cannot trace at first. You may not feel it, but it is happening. Just because your natural eyes do not perceive movement does not mean that the spiritual world is not trembling at the sound of your words. Elijah prayed for rain after a long drought, and his servant looked at the sky 6 times and saw nothing. But Elijah kept praying because he understood that invisible power was already at work. On the 7th time, a small cloud appeared, and soon after, the heavens opened with a downpour. The visible results came only after persistence in prayer moved things in the invisible realm. We often want instant evidence, but prayer is not a vending machine. It is a weapon, and a weapon, when used properly, produces impact even if you do not see it immediately. A soldier fires a bullet, and though he does not watch it fly through the air with the naked eye, He knows it will hit its target in the same way. When you release prayer, you may not see its flight, but you can trust it is aimed at its destination. You must understand that when you kneel down, when you lift your voice, when you pour out your heart to God, something is already set in motion. Invisible forces are already working to bring forth a visible change. Think about the walls of Jericho. The people of Israel marched around them day after day, praying, shouting, believing. On the outside, it looked foolish. The wall stood strong, the stones did not move. The enemy inside probably laughed. But what they did not know was that with every march, with every prayer, with every shout, something was shaking in the invisible. And on the seventh day, what had been happening unseen suddenly manifested, and those massive walls collapsed before their eyes. That is the power of prayer. It may look as though nothing is happening, but invisible power is building up until the moment it breaks through into the visible. Prayer also produces visible results within you before it ever changes what is around you. You may pray for your situation to change, but God begins by changing you. Fear gives way to courage. Anxiety gives way to peace. Hopelessness gives way to faith. These are visible results because people around you can see your countenance lift, your spirit rise, your words shift. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not the change of circumstances, but the transformation of the person in the midst of those circumstances. That transformation begins in the invisible work of prayer and then shows up in visible confidence, joy, and strength. Consider how prayer has produced visible healing in countless lives. Doctors have declared patients incurable, yet after prayer, test results change. Tumors shrank, organs revived, bodies restored. These are visible outcomes of an invisible weapon. Finances have turned around, marriages have been restored, addictions have been broken, all through prayer. No scientific explanation can capture how it happens, but the evidence stands. Undeniable prayer may be invisible, but it produces results you can see with your own eyes. This is why the enemy wants you to doubt prayer. He wants you to believe that silence means nothing is happening. He wants you to quit before the results appear. But if you give up too soon, you forfeit the harvest that was already on its way. Remember, seeds do not sprout the day you plant them. They sprout after time, after unseen processes beneath the soil have done their work. Prayer is the same. You must trust the unseen process and hold on until it breaks forth visibly. Prayer is also cumulative. Ever you pray adds weight, adds pressure, adds power in the invisible. It is like water dripping on a stone. At first, nothing seems to happen, but over time the constant drops wear the stone down until it finally breaks. The same is true in the spiritual realm. Your prayers may seem small and unnoticed, but each one is adding to the breakthrough. Each word spoken in faith is striking against the obstacle until at last the visible result appears. The invisible weapon of prayer also produces results not just for you, but for others. You may never know how many lives were spared, how many hearts were touched, how many doors were opened because someone somewhere prayed. A mother prays for her child, and years later that child testifies to having been saved from disaster. A community prays for revival, and suddenly people begin to hunger for God in ways no program could create. Nations have been turned because people prayed. All of this proves that prayer is not powerless. It is the most powerful weapon that changes visible reality because it operates first in the invisible. And perhaps this is the greatest encouragement. You do not have to see it working to know it is working. Faith is believing that though your eyes see no evidence, your heart trusts that God is moving. Faith is what connects the invisible power of prayer to the visible results of life. Without faith, prayer is only words, but with faith, prayer becomes the most unstoppable weapon in the universe. And when you wield it faithfully, patiently, persistently, the invisible will always give birth to the visible. So let me urge you, never despise the unseen, never underestimate the hidden. The most important work is often done where no one can see. When you pray in your room alone, unseen by the world, you are shaking heaven and altering earth. You are moving in the invisible, and one day you will look around and see results you cannot deny. Because prayer may be invisible, but its fruit is always visible. It is the weapon God has given you to change not only your life, but the world around you. Prayer connects the powerless with the all-powerful. Nothing describes its beauty and power better than this truth. Humanity on its own is fragile. We may think we are strong, but our strength has limits. Our minds can only comprehend so much. Our hands can only build so much. Our bodies can only endure so much. Life has a way of reminding us that no matter how powerful we believe we are in reality weak and dependent. A single sickness can bring a strong man to his knees. A single tragedy can shatter a family's sense of security. A single financial collapse can erase years of effort. On our own, we are powerless against the uncertainties of life, the schemes of the enemy, and the weight of our own humanity. But prayer is the great connector. It takes weak, trembling, powerless people and ties them to the unlimited strength of the God who spoke the heavens and the earth into being. Imagine electricity. A lamp has the potential to shine, but until it is plugged into a power source, it remains dark. The lamp is not defective. It was created with the ability to glow, but without connection, it cannot function as designed. Human beings are like that lamp. We were created with the capacity to live in light, to shine, to fulfill great purposes. But disconnected from God, we remain powerless. Prayer is the cord that connects us to the divine current. The moment we pray, we plug ourselves into the eternal source of strength, wisdom, peace, and power. Without prayer, we flicker in the dark. With prayer, we shine with light not our own. Prayer is the great equalizer. It does not matter if you are rich or poor, educated or uneducated, strong or weak. When you pray, you connect with the same all-powerful God. The world honors power based on position, money, fame, or influence, but none of those things can guarantee peace of mind, healing in the body, or salvation of the soul. A billionaire cannot buy healing for an incurable disease. A king cannot order joy into a broken heart. A genius cannot outthink despair, but the most humble person with no wealth, no status, no influence can kneel in prayer and tap into the power of the Almighty. Prayer takes the powerless and places them in direct connection with the one who has all power in heaven and on earth. This is why prayer humbles the proud and lifts the lowly. The proud often think they do not need God because they rely on their own resources, their own strength, their own intelligence, but when life confronts them with something they cannot control, they suddenly realize that all their power is limited. On the other hand, the lowly, the weak, the desperate, those who seem to have nothing, they find in prayer a strength that the world cannot understand. A poor widow can pray and see miracles. A sick child can pray and touch heaven. A man in prison can pray and experience freedom of the soul. Prayer does not discriminate. It connects every powerless heart to the same limitless God. The Bible is filled with examples of this. Hannah was a barren woman with no ability to change her situation. She was powerless to produce a child. But when she prayed, her cry connected her to the God who opens wombs, and she gave birth to Samuel, one of the greatest prophets of Israel. David was a shepherd boy, powerless in the eyes of men, facing a giant warrior armed with weapons and armor. But David prayed and declared his trust in God, and that connection gave him victory over Goliath with just a stone and a sling. The early church was powerless before the might of the Roman Empire. They had no political clout, no armies, no wealth. Yet when they prayed, prisons shook, chains fell off, and the gospel spread until it turned the world upside down. Powerless people connected through prayer became unstoppable. The beauty of this connection is that it is not temporary. God does not lend his strength only for a moment and then withdraw it. He invites us to live in constant communion with him through prayer. That means you can wake up every morning and connect to power greater than any challenge you will face that day. You can go to bed every night knowing that the God who never sleeps is working on your behalf. You can walk through valley storms and battles with peace because you are not relying on your own strength, but on the strength of the one who is all-powerful. There is also a relational aspect to this truth. Prayer does not just connect us to God's power, it connects us to God himself. Some people seek prayer only for what it can bring them, healing, provision, breakthrough. But the greatest gift of prayer is not the things God does for us, but the fact that prayer brings us into his presence. To know him, to feel his nearness, to hear his voice, that is the ultimate connection. And from that relationship flows every kind of strength you need. When you truly know God through prayer, you discover that even in your weakness, you are strong because his strength is made perfect in weakness. This connection also produces boldness. When you know you are backed by God's power, you no longer tremble before life's challenges. A powerless person is timid, uncertain, and easily defeated. But once that powerless person prays and touches the hem of God's garment, courage rises up. Suddenly they face giants with faith. They endure trials with patience. They confront obstacles with determination. The visible change is dramatic, but it began with the invisible act of prayer. That connection transforms the way you think, the way you act, the way you speak. But perhaps the most important truth is this: no matter how powerless you feel, you are never too weak to pray. Even if you can barely whisper, even if your strength is gone, even if all you can do is cry out in desperation, that is enough. Prayer is not about eloquence or volume. It is about connection. The faintest cry of a powerless heart reaches the ear of the all-powerful God, and once you are connected, his power flows into your weakness. He fights battles you cannot fight. He carries burdens you cannot carry. He opens doors you cannot open. He does what only he can do. So when you feel powerless, do not despair. That feeling is not the end. It is the invitation. It is the reminder that you were never meant to rely on your own strength anyway. Lift your eyes, lift your voice, and pray. Because in that moment, you connect your nothingness to God's everything, your weakness to his strength. your limits to his limitless power. And in that connection, you discover that you are not powerless after all, for the one who is all-powerful is living, moving, and fighting on your behalf. Prayer is a spiritual battlefield strategy. It is not a retreat, not an escape, not a quiet hiding place where you go only to avoid the noise of life. Prayer is not weakness. It is warfare. When you pray, you are not running away from the fight. You are stepping into the command center of heaven where strategies are formed, weapons are released, and victories are secured before they ever show up in the natural world. The battles you face every day are not only physical, emotional, or circumstantial, they are spiritual. That means you cannot win them with human strength alone. You cannot fight depression with logic. You cannot conquer fear with money. You cannot defeat temptation with willpower alone. These battles require a spiritual strategy, and prayer is that strategy. Too many people think prayer is the last resort, something you try when nothing else works. But prayer was never designed to be a backup plan. Prayer is the battle plan. The general of an army does not wait until his soldiers are defeated before calling a strategy meeting. He plans before the fight begins. In the same way, you should not wait until your life is falling apart before you pray. You pray before the storm, you pray during the storm, and you pray after the storm, because prayer is how you prepare, how you fight, and how you walk in victory. The world may see prayer as inactivity, but in reality, it is the most decisive action you can take. When you pray, you move the hand of God. When you pray, you unleash forces that the enemy cannot stop. The Bible makes this clear when it says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, and spiritual wickedness in high places. That means your real battle is not with people, not with bosses, not with neighbors, not even with yourself. The real fight is spiritual, and if the battle is spiritual, then the weapon must also be spiritual. That weapon is prayer. You cannot see the enemy with your eyes, but prayer strikes him where he cannot hide. You cannot predict the enemy's moves, but prayer positions you under the guidance of the one who knows the end from the beginning. Prayer is not just you talking to God. It is you aligning with heaven's army against the forces of darkness. Look at the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. The Israelites did not use traditional warfare to bring down those massive walls. They did not build ladders. They did not construct battering rams. They did not fire arrows. Instead, God gave them a spiritual strategy: march, worship, shout, and pray. To human eyes, it looked foolish, but to God it was perfect. Those prayers and shouts were not wasted breath. They were weapons, and at the appointed moment, the walls fell flat. That is the nature of prayer. It seems foolish to the natural mind, but it dismantles strongholds that nothing else can touch. Daniel understood this battlefield strategy when he prayed 3 times a day, even though the king's decree threatened his life. To others, his prayers looked like stubbornness, but in the spiritual realm, his prayers were weakening the power of idolatry in Babylon and strengthening the testimony of God among the nations. The early church used this strategy too. When Peter was thrown in prison, they did not march with weapons or petition the Roman officials. They prayed. And the Bible says an angel came, chains fell off, doors opened, and Peter walked free. Prayer was the strategy that accomplished what human effort could not. This is why the devil fears praying people. He does not fear a Christian who only talks about God but never prays. He does not fear someone who knows the scriptures but never bends their knee. He trembles when a believer understands prayer as a battlefield strategy, because he knows that prayer is the one weapon that can bring his strongholds down. He cannot fight against a praying church. He cannot withstand a praying family. He cannot hold captive a praying soul. The strategy of prayer outmaneuvers him every single time. Think about a military commander who has the advantage of intelligence reports. He knows where the enemy is, what their weaknesses are, and when they will attack. That knowledge gives him victory before the first shot is fired. Prayer is like that intelligence report. Through prayer, God gives you wisdom you could never have on your own. He shows you what to say, where to go, how to act. He opens your eyes to dangers you did not see. He closes doors that look good but would lead to destruction. He strengthens you to stand when the pressure comes. Prayer is the strategy that keeps you from walking blindly into defeat. And prayer is not only defensive, it is offensive. It is not just about protecting yourself, it is about advancing the kingdom of God. When you pray, you are not sitting back waiting for the enemy to strike. You are taking the fight to him. You are declaring God's promises over your life, your family, your city, your nation. You are pushing back the darkness and claiming territory for the light. Prayer is not retreat. It is advance. It is marching forward with faith that God has already given you the victory. That is why Jesus taught us to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." That is not passive. That is an aggressive call for heaven to invade earth, for the power of God to invade the brokenness of this world. Prayer also unites the body of Christ in the battle. A soldier never fights alone, and neither should a believer. When God's people join together in prayer, their combined faith multiplies the impact. One can chase 1,000, but two can put 10,000 to flight. That is spiritual mathematics. Prayer multiplies strength. Families that pray together create a fortress the enemy cannot penetrate. Churches that pray together become flames that light up entire cities. Nations that pray together see revival sweep across their land. Prayer is not just a personal strategy, it is a collective one, a unifying force that makes God's people unstoppable. So when you face battles in your life, do not think you are powerless. Do not imagine that you are at the mercy of circumstances. You have a strategy in your hands that is greater than any weapon of this world. Use it. Pray before the battle begins. Pray while it rages. Pray until the victory is secured. Do not give up because the fight looks fierce. The fiercer the fight, the more powerful your prayers must become. And when you pray, know this, you are not alone. Heaven's armies are backing you. God himself is leading you. The Spirit of God is interceding for you with groanings that cannot be uttered. Prayer is not escape. It is engagement. It is not surrender. It is conquest. Every time you pray, you are not retreating. You are advancing. You are writing the strategy of victory with your faith-filled words. And sooner or later, what you fought for in the invisible will become visible. The mountain will move. The chain will break. The wall will fall. The enemy will flee. Because prayer is the battlefield strategy that never fails when it is wielded in faith. Prayer changes atmospheres before it changes circumstances. That is one of the deepest truths about the power of prayer, and it is something many people miss. When we come before God in prayer, we often focus on asking Him to change the situation around us, heal my body, fix my finances, restore my family, open this door. And yes, prayer absolutely has the power to transform those circumstances, but the first thing prayer does is shift the atmosphere in which you live, think, and breathe. Before God changes what is happening around you, He begins by changing what is happening inside you and around you in the unseen realm. Prayer alters the climate of your heart, the tone of your spirit, the weight of your environment. Once the atmosphere is shifted, the circumstances begin to align. Have you ever walked into a room and felt tension even before a word was spoken? Atmospheres can be heavy, dark, filled with fear or anger. On the other hand, there are times when you walk into a place and immediately sense peace, warmth, and joy. That is atmosphere. It cannot be touched, but it can be felt. It cannot be seen, but it can be experienced. And that atmosphere affects the way people think, the way they act, and the way they respond. Prayer has the supernatural ability to shift that invisible atmosphere from one of fear to one of faith, from one of despair to one of hope, from one of heaviness to one of joy. This is why prayer must never be underestimated. Sometimes the situation does not change instantly, but prayer gives you the strength to endure, the peace to stand, the clarity to decide, and the courage to move forward. Those things come from a shift in atmosphere. Circumstances may remain the same for a while, but because the atmosphere has shifted, you are no longer crushed by them. The storm may not be over, but the storm inside of you is calmed. And often, once that atmosphere shifts, the external storm loses its power and begins to fade. Jesus demonstrated this in His ministry. When He stepped into a place filled with doubt, unbelief, or fear, the atmosphere was heavy. But when He prayed, when He spoke the Word of God, that atmosphere shifted and miracles began to happen. When He went to raise Jairus' daughter from the dead, He found people weeping and wailing in despair. The atmosphere was one of hopelessness. But He told them to stop weeping because she was only asleep. He changed the atmosphere with His words, and in that new environment of faith, the girl was brought back to life. Circumstances followed the atmosphere. The same happened when Paul and Silas were in prison. Their circumstances were terrible. They had been beaten, chained, and thrown into the inner dungeon. Yet, instead of being crushed by despair, they began to pray and sing hymns to God. In the natural, nothing had changed. They were still in prison, but the atmosphere shifted. The heaviness of fear was replaced by joy. The hopelessness of captivity was replaced by worship. And once the atmosphere changed, the circumstances followed, the foundations of the prison shook, the doors flew open, and the chains fell off. Prayer first changed the atmosphere, and then it changed the circumstances. This principle is vital because so many people give up on prayer when they do not see immediate change. They think God is not listening because the circumstances are still the same. But if you look deeper, you will see that God often begins by changing the unseen environment first. He works on your heart, your peace, your faith, your perspective. He lifts the heaviness. He clears the confusion. He restores the joy. Once the atmosphere shifts, the situation is already on its way to breakthrough. Think about your own life. How many times have you carried a burden so heavy that it felt impossible to continue? Then you went to prayer, and though the problem was still there when you got up from your knees, you felt different. The weight was lifted. The fear was quieted. The hopelessness was replaced by assurance. That was not your imagination. That was prayer changing the atmosphere. And once that shift happened, you found the strength to keep walking, to keep believing, to keep trusting until the answer came. Atmospheres matter because they create environments where either faith or fear can grow. Fear thrives in a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. Doubt multiplies where the air is thick with negativity. But faith blossoms in an atmosphere of prayer. Hope rises in an environment filled with worship. Healing flows in a space where the presence of God is invited. That is why it is so important to pray not just for what you want God to do, but for the atmosphere in your life, your home, your workplace, and your community. When you pray, Lord, let your peace fill this place, you are inviting Him to shift the invisible environment so that His will can be done more easily in the visible. We see this in revivals throughout history. When groups of people began to pray, the atmosphere of entire cities shifted, taverns emptied, crime decreased, hearts softened, and people began to seek God. Those changes did not come because of political programs or human effort. They came because prayer created a new atmosphere. Once the atmosphere was changed, the circumstances of people's lives began to align with God's purposes. That is the unseen power of prayer at work. Another reason prayer changes atmospheres first is because God wants to prepare us to handle the breakthrough when it comes. If He changed the circumstance without first changing the atmosphere, we might miss it, doubt it, or even mishandle it. But when prayer shifts our spirit into a place of peace and faith, we are ready to receive the miracle. The soil of our heart is prepared, and the blessing can take root. That is why sometimes you will notice your faith growing long before the answer arrives. God is changing the atmosphere so that when the circumstance changes, you are ready to step fully into it. So the next time you pray, do not be discouraged if you do not see instant results. Pay attention to the atmosphere. Notice the peace that comes, the clarity that rises, the joy that returns. That is not small. That is the beginning of the miracle. That is God already at work. And if you stay in prayer, the same power that shifted the atmosphere will eventually shift the circumstance. The prison doors will open, the walls will fall, the healing will manifest, the provision will come. Prayer always works from the unseen to the seen, from the atmosphere to the circumstance. This is why you must keep praying, keep worshiping, keep declaring God's promises even when the visible has not yet changed. You are changing the invisible climate, and once the climate shifts, the harvest is inevitable. Prayer makes your heart fertile ground for faith. It makes your home a place of peace. It makes your spirit a dwelling place for God's presence. And when those atmospheres are set, circumstances will align with what God has already declared. Prayer is more than asking. It is more than words. It is atmosphere-changing power. It invites heaven to breathe into the air you live in. It drives out the heaviness of despair and replaces it with the fragrance of hope. It takes the chaos of fear and replaces it with the calm of faith. It turns prisons into sanctuaries, deserts into gardens, and valleys into places of praise. That is why prayer is never wasted, never empty, never ineffective. Because before it changes your situation, it changes the atmosphere in which that situation exists. And once the atmosphere shifts, the circumstances cannot remain the same. Prayer is the key that unlocks heaven's intervention on earth. That is why it is the greatest privilege, the most powerful responsibility, and the most extraordinary gift that God has placed in human hands. We live in a world filled with locked doors of opportunity, locked doors of healing, locked doors of restoration, locked doors of destiny. There are things that we cannot open by ourselves, no matter how hard we push, no matter how much strength we use, no matter how much effort we apply. It is not that we are weak, it is that the door requires a key. That key is prayer. Without it, we stand in front of barriers, frustrated and weary. With it, we unlock the supernatural help of heaven and invite God Himself to move in situations that seem sealed shut. Prayer is heaven's key because it bridges the gap between God's eternal will and our earthly reality. God is sovereign and all-powerful, but He has chosen to work through prayer to bring His will into manifestation. It is as though the resources of heaven, healing, provision, deliverance, strength, peace, are stored behind a great door, and prayer is the key that unlocks them so they can flow into our lives. When Jesus taught His disciples to pray, He told them to ask, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." That statement reveals that prayer is the means by which heaven's order breaks into earth's chaos. It is not about convincing God to do something against His will. It is about aligning ourselves with His will and unlocking what He already desires to give. Think of a key for a moment. A key does not create the contents of the room. It simply gives you access. In the same way, prayer does not create the blessings of God, because those blessings already exist in Him. Prayer grants you access to them. Healing, deliverance, restoration, peace, and joy are already part of God's heart for His children. But it is through prayer that you take the key in your hand, unlock the door, and step into what God has prepared. Without the key, you stand outside. With the key, you enter in. That is why prayerlessness leaves us feeling shut out, frustrated, and empty, while a life of prayer makes us feel open, connected, and filled with God's presence. The Scriptures are filled with stories that show how prayer unlocked heaven's intervention. When Elijah prayed on Mount Carmel, fire came down from heaven to consume the sacrifice and prove that the Lord alone is God. That fire did not come because Elijah was strong or wise. It came because prayer unlocked it. When Hezekiah received a death sentence from the prophet Isaiah, he turned his face to the wall and prayed, and heaven unlocked 15 more years of life for him. When Peter was imprisoned and the church prayed, heaven unlocked an angelic rescue mission that broke his chains and opened the prison doors. These examples remind us that no matter how impossible the situation may look, prayer is the key that invites God to intervene. There is a humility in prayer that makes it powerful. To use a key, you must admit you cannot open the door by yourself. You cannot break it down. You cannot force it open. That is what prayer teaches us, that we are not self-sufficient. Prayer is our confession that we need God, that the problem is greater than our strength, but not greater than His. And when we humble ourselves and use the key of prayer, heaven responds. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And prayer is the act of bowing low so that heaven's grace can be unlocked over our lives. The key of prayer is not only for personal needs, it is also for others. You can unlock doors of freedom for people who are bound. You can unlock doors of hope for those in despair. You can unlock doors of salvation for your family, your community, even your nation. Intercessory prayer is taking the key not only for yourself, but for those who do not yet know how to use it. When you pray for others, you place their situation before God's throne, and in doing so, you turn the key that allows heaven to intervene in their behalf. How many stories could be told of mothers and fathers who prayed for their children, and those children came back to faith after years of wandering? How many stories of communities transformed because a handful of believers gathered and prayed until heaven broke through? That is the power of the key of prayer. It is also important to understand that the key works because of relationship. A key only fits if it has been cut to match the lock. Prayer works when it is aligned with God's heart. Selfish, prideful prayers cannot unlock heaven's blessings, but prayers spoken in faith, humility, and alignment with God's will always find a match. That is why Jesus said, "Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you." The promise is not empty. It is rooted in the fact that when you pray in His name, when you pray according to His will, the key fits perfectly into the lock and the door opens wide. Sometimes, though, the key must be turned more than once. Some doors open with one turn, others require persistence. That is why Jesus told the parable of the persistent widow who kept knocking until the unjust judge gave her justice. He was teaching that persistence in prayer is not begging God, but continuing to turn the key until the lock finally gives way. Some breakthroughs take time, not because God is unwilling, but because unseen battles are being fought. Faith is being strengthened, and timing is being prepared. But the promise remains: keep praying, keep turning the key, and the door will open. The beauty of this truth is that no one is locked out of using this key. It is not reserved for pastors, prophets, or spiritual leaders. Every believer has been given the privilege of prayer. A child can use it. An elderly saint can use it. A new believer can use it. It is the inheritance of every child of God. And every time you use it, you are unlocking the intervention of heaven in ways you may not even fully understand. You may not see the entire process, but you will see the results. So imagine the doors that stand before you right now. Doors that seem shut. Dreams that feel delayed. Battles that feel unwinnable. These are not barriers meant to keep you locked out forever. They are doors waiting for the right key, and you hold that key. It is prayer. When you pray, you are not wasting words. You are not talking to the ceiling. You are not engaging in an empty ritual. You are sliding the key into the lock, turning it with faith, and releasing the power of heaven into the earth. Prayer is heaven's key, and it is in your hands. Do not leave it unused. Do not let it gather dust. Do not stand outside doors that God has called you to enter. Pray, unlock, step in, and as you do, you will see heaven invade earth, miracles manifest in the natural, and the impossible become possible. Because prayer is the key that unlocks heaven's intervention on earth. And when you use it, nothing can keep God's power from reaching you.